Hello, Wobbly Phil here. There were some quirky, some might prefer to say innovative, motorcycles designed and built in the 1970s. Hardly a week went past without hearing that a mad mechanic or demented manufacturer had reinvented the wheel. I suppose the equivalent of those folk nowadays would be Elon Musk. But not all of these weird ideas ended up in the trash can of history. No, some of them made it into production, and you could go to the shops and buy them. So prepare to be gobsmacked by the 10 strangest motorcycles of the 1970s that you could actually buy. I'm kicking off this list with a machine that usually trumps any other in a compendium of crazy motorcycles of the 1970s, the Quasar. Launched in 1976 with a Reliant engine, only 21 were produced, and only 7 of those were made by the original designers, Malcolm Newell and Ken Lehman. But what the Quasar lacked in sales, it made up for in publicity. I remember we were blown away when we first glimpsed it in the 1970s, and it still looked like the future in the 1980s, when a few more were turned out with Suzuki and Honda engines. It was still being featured on Top Gear in 1988. They were jaw-droppingly expensive, being built and assembled by hand. The sticker price, including tax, was £5,885, something like £24,500 in today's money, which would get you a brand new BMW M1000R and change. There are a couple of reasons why I've placed it last in this top 10. The first is because it was, frankly, a heroic failure. Despite many attempts to get it off the ground, it never flew and only sold in handfuls. And secondly, once we'd got over the shock of the new back then, it suddenly dawned on us that this wasn't anything terribly original. It was just a Bond bug that had been chopped in half. Number 9. The Ariel 3. And here it is, whatever it is. No, that's not me being facetious, much as I like being facetious, but the actual advertising slogan that BSA used for their, whatever it is. This truly horrendous piece of crap, stroke charming and adorable little moped, insert preference here, was a 50cc 2-stroke 3-wheeler that even your 90-year-old granny wouldn't have been seen dead on, running down to Tesco's to buy her weekly crate of Synatogen. Or maybe she would, because it handled that badly due to its 12-inch wheels and hinged, some might say unhinged, front end, that it earned the nickname the Granny Killer. BSA owned the Ariel mark in the 1970s, and a cynical management thought they could capitalise on the proud British name with a 70-year history that had come up with the glorious Square 4. Forgetting, of course, that by the 1970s, the Ariel brand was more likely to conjure up washing powder in most Brits' minds than a motorcycle. Even scantily clad ladies couldn't sell it when it looked as if they had been struck down by a catastrophic case of thrush just by sitting on it. You can still buy them at auction for anything from a few £100s to £3,000, proving that you can indeed be paid to have rubbish taken away. Number 8. Anything Eastern European. Back in the 1970s, I lived a couple of miles from an RAF base that had previously been used by the US Air Force. I'd often be woken in the middle of the night by something fearsomely powerful being spooled up and sent off to intercept Soviet jets over the North Sea, it being the height of the Cold War. Which is why we were all scratching our heads when we saw bikes like the CZ, Jawa and Ural. These machines were manufactured in the Eastern Bloc by our sworn enemies, presumably using the same tooling they used to make the tanks that would imminently roll into West Germany. Not only that, they looked, performed and handled like the tanks that would imminently roll into West Germany. Somehow it seemed unpatriotic at the time to line the pockets of evil communist regimes, but a few folk were tempted by the bargain basement prices and definitely got what they paid for. While they'd never win any beauty competitions or hill climbs, I do recall owners saying the things just went on and on and on, even after all the paintwork and chrome had peeled off and the silencers had rusted through, about a week after they rode them out of the showroom. Number 7. The Honda CX500. The plastic maggot, to use the nickname it gained because of its plug-ugly looks and lashings of moulded parts, began life in Japan in 1977, reaching UK shores a year later. This bike really was an oddity in the 1970s when water-cooled engines were rare, shaft drives were rare, and an odd twisted V-twin configuration was off the unicorn scale. Was it a BMW Boxer twin? No. Was it a Motor Guzzi V-twin? No. The darn thing didn't even have a kickstart, and it sported Comstar wheels shod with the first ever tubeless tyres used on a production motorcycle. Even more strangely, this bike was made by Honda, the home of the dull but reliable inline 4. We didn't really know what to make of it, and we especially didn't know what to make of the Turbo Maggot, which Honda released a few years later. But it gained a place in the hearts of motorcycle couriers to the extent that you couldn't move for maggots in London in the 1980s and 1990s. Even now you can find them transformed into ludicrous hipster bikes on eBay. Number 6. The Munch Mammut. If you had a lazy $4,000 burning a hole in your pocket, you could have gone out and bought one of these behemoths in the 1970s. This was a motorcycle on steroids, mind-boggling and like nothing else we'd ever seen. We only ever caught a glimpse of it in magazines, and when we did, our eyes popped out of our heads. I've made an entire video on the Munch Mammut, so do take a look if you want to know more about this weird and wonderful machine. The link is in the description. Number 5. The Suzuki RE5. You can't compile a list of strange bikes of the 1970s without having a wankle or two. Once touted as the future of motorcycling, the Rotary engine promised smooth power and performance that was superior to multiple pistons at the time. And nobody cared a tuppenny toss about noxious emissions in the early 1970s. After all, we hadn't yet been weaned off two-strokes. Invented by German engineer Felix Wankel in the 1930s, originally as a compressor, by the 1970s all four big Japanese manufacturers were reported to be toying with the rotary engine. Kawasaki and Honda were rumoured to have tested prototypes. Yamaha even showed off a twin-rotor concept bike at the 1972 Tokyo Motor Show, but Suzuki was the only Japanese company that brought a Wankel to market. The liquid-cooled machine wasn't only quirky by dint of its power plant. Suzuki hired Italian stylist Giorgetto Giugiaro to put a few finishing touches on the RE5. The same man we met in my video about the Ducati SS's, and whose name I've almost certainly mispronounced again. Riffing on the rotary theme, Signore Giugiaro, who later designed an entirely new shape of pasta, was responsible for the tin can instrument cluster, tubular tail light and spherical indicators that gave the RE5 its strange, distinctive look. I actually spotted a couple of these exotic beasts at the time, even though I lived in a shabby seaside town in the south of England. Despite Suzuki having put in some heavy lifting R&D wise, for example the twist grip worked 5 different cables and they took out 20 patents to do with the electroplating of the rotor housing, there were reports of dead spots, backfires and grinding vibration, but praise was heaped on the handling, exhaust note and ground clearance. 6,500 RE5s were made between 1974 and 1976, with constant improvements and fixes made by Suzuki. In 1985, it made Cycle World's Top 10 Worst Motorcycles list, where it was described as expensive, overcomplicated, underpowered, and hideous, which precipitated a flurry of letters from angry owners. These days, I'd say it's definitely got retro appeal. A decent example will set you back about 10 grand. Or how about a project bike for as little as 3,000? And good luck with getting that on the road. Number 4. The Yamaha TX750. It looks like a Yamaha, it sounds like a Yamaha, but by golly, it did not go like a Yamaha. And that makes it strange, very strange indeed. Launched in 1972, Yamaha knocked out around 33,000 of these, and initially they won praise for speed, torque and superior smoothness to typical British twins of the time. There were some innovations too. It was the first Yamaha to sport aluminium wheel rims. There were dual front disc brakes and space-age warning lights would even tell you if your headlamp or brake bulbs had blown, or if your rear brake shoes were wearing dangerously thin. All topped off with a sparkly metal flake paint job. True, it was a bit on the sluggish and heavy side, but that was the least of its problems. To solve the perennial issue of vibration on the twin, Yamaha went down an untested route by incorporating a balancer shaft in the engine, driven by a chain.
One of the big features of the TX750 is less vibration. First, look at this scene. Next, let's place the camera on the TX750 and take a picture. See, the TX750 produces very little vibration. The balancer is attached to the crankshaft in order to counterbalance the crankshaft vibration.
These were prone to failure, and even if they didn't fail, they churned your engine oil to froth with predictable results. Aerated oil meant big ends and main bearings failed, or at the very least, the oil would leak out through all the gaskets. Starter motor chains were prone to failure too. I remember word on the street in the 70s was that this was definitely one to avoid, and nowadays it resides in the "Where Are They Now" file. You'll still see some examples for sale if you want to risk it, and I suppose the ones that are advertised as being modified for reliability would have to be at the top of your list. Number 3. Any of the weird moped-y looking things designed to tempt us teenagers to part with the pennies from our pocket money. The bike sheds at our school were awash with these things in the 1970s, to the extent that if you were nipping round the back for a crafty silk cut, you'd stand half a chance of being mown down by a 16-year-old on his Yamaha Fizzy, Fantic Chopper or Caballero, Gilera Trial, Puck or Puke Grand Prix, Honda SS50, Suzuki AP50 or Gorelli Tiger. You see, here in the UK, as long as it still came equipped with bicycle pedals, you could ride anything under 50 cc's with learner plates, as soon as you'd blown out the candles on your 16th birthday cake. And we all did. The manufacturers came up with any and every weird wheeze to persuade our young, impressionable minds that we'd look cool, sexy, and devastatingly attractive to the opposite sex just by jumping on one of these, and our hormones agreed with them 100%.
Fucking wanker.
Fizzy makes him look good to Rachel Roberts, though.
Nowadays, you occasionally see 60-something men on their treasured FS1Es pushing them up hills, having come to terms with the harsh reality that the meagre 5 horses on offer will no longer propel them and the extra 140 pounds they've gained since their teens up more than a slight incline. Number 2. The Hercules W2000. The second rotary-engined bike in the top 5. I could probably have filled all 5 places with rotary machines. Hercules began life as a German bicycle maker in 1886, but by the 1970s it had merged with Sachs and presented a Wankel prototype in 1970 at the Cologne Motorcycle Show. By 1974 these bikes were on sale, and here in the UK they were marketed under the DKW brand. Contrary to the suggestion in its name, the equivalent cubic capacity was nothing like 2000 cc's. Its single-rotor air-cooled engine was just shy of 300 cc's, and power output was a measly 20-something horsepower. Customers seem to have quite liked their 2000s. Much simpler than the Suzuki RE5, they were reportedly reliable if a bit plodding, and the ground clearance was nothing to write home about. Only around a couple of thousand were made during their 3-year production run, and if you fancy something quirky that'll certainly turn heads at your monthly bike meet, you can pick one up these days for 3 or 4 grand. Fun fact, once production ceased, all the factory tooling was sold to Norton to further their Wankel effort. I've made an entire video about the Norton rotary bike, the link is in the description. Number 1. The Amazonas 1600. If you thought the Goldwing was a flying brick, then this Brazilian big boy was a flying brick shithouse. Christened the Motosaurus by the bike press when it was launched in 1978, the Amazonas was a monstrous motorcycle that was powered by a 1600cc VW Beetle engine. Proving, though, that size isn't everything, the bike's air-cooled 4-cylinder boxer engine put out a weedy 53 horsepower, which propelled all 407 kilos, almost 900 pounds, to a top speed of just 87 miles per hour, or 140 kph. Compare that to a modern-day BMW K1600, on which you'll be rocketed to a top speed of almost 190 miles per hour, with 100 more ponies on tap. But with an 8-gallon petrol tank, the thing was a mile muncher, jogging along in its fiberglass shroud at 55 miles per hour for at least 300 miles. If that is, you could put up with the bone-crunching suspension, unbelievably heavy controls, and what one reviewer described as problematic directional stability. The Brazilian government banned the import of foreign motor vehicles in 1976. The police and military still needed motorbikes though, so the Amazon came about to fill the gap. From what I can see, less than 1,000 were built, but you could buy them outside of Brazil, a few were shipped to the USA, and a handful made it to Europe. Amazingly, it lived on, rebranded as the Kahina 1600 ST until 1999. You can still find used examples for around 10 grand, but they were considered an engineering disaster, so buyer beware. And there you have it, our number 1 strangest motorcycle of the 1970s, and all without a single puerile comment about popping down the high street for a quick Brazilian. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing to let YouTube know we're doing something right here at 3 Phils. Thank you.